Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Engaging with Meditative Inquiry and Teaching, Learning, and Research Conference. Our first session for today is, just a moment, I'm enabling the auto transcription. There we are. Our first session for today is a panel on meditative inquiry and teaching and learning in higher education. The panelists have devised a group presentation, so I'll be leaving it to them after I introduce them. First, Dr. Angie Kolen is a professor in human kinetics, currently on sabbatical leave, but was most recently the coordinator of St. Francis Xavier University's Teaching and Learning Center. Joining her is Dr. Leigh-Ann MacFarlane, who is an education developer in the Teaching and Learning Center at Mount St. Vincent University, with 15 years teaching experience at universities in the province. The third panelist is Dr. Suzanne Sheffield, who is the executive director of the Center for Learning and Teaching at Dalhousie University, where she has been director since 2012. She has over 25 years of educational development and university teaching experience. And lastly, Dr. Gavan is the Associate Vice President, Teaching and Learning, and Director of the Center for Innovation in Teaching and Learning at Memorial University in St. John's, Newfoundland. So before their session actually begins, Dr. Angie Kolen is going to be offering a meditation.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like you to get yourselves comfortable. So I've chosen to stand because I want to feel my feet on the floor. If you'd like to stand, take a moment to do that. Nobody will see what you're doing, or perhaps you might want to lay on the floor. You could get into that position as you're listening, or if you're comfortable in your chair, just sit back in the chair. The thing is to get comfortable. Just let your body relax for a moment. I'd like you to either close or soften your eyes. I really don't want you to look at anything. I just want you to relax, just to breathe. You might want to put your hand on your belly. You might want to feel the air going in and out. Maybe you want to put your hands in a yoga prayer position. Maybe you even want to reach up as you breathe in, and as you breathe out, bring your arms down. Whatever works for you. There's no judgment here. I just want you to breathe. I want you to try to clear your heads. I want you to not think of anything. I'm hoping my voice is not distracting in clearing your thoughts. Just breathe. If the thoughts won't go away, acknowledge them. Try to just let them sit for a moment as you give yourself the time and space to prepare for this session. You can focus on the air around you. What's the temperature in the room that you're in? Can you feel the breeze? Is there an open window? Can you feel it on your skin? How's that feel? Just turn your awareness to what's the air like. You might focus on smells. If you have an open window, can you smell the scent of flowers or freshly mowed lawn or the after effects of rain? There's a unique smell that comes with that. Perhaps it's a room air freshener. Just what do you notice? There's no judgment, just what do you notice? And I want you to feel where you're sitting, standing, or laying. If you're standing like I am, I want you to think about your feet, the ground beneath it, the reaction of your body as you press down. Just notice. If you're sitting in your chair, feel the cushioning of the chair, or the wood, or the hardwood, that didn't sound great, or the wood that you're sitting on. Just feel your body as you're sitting, relaxing, continuing to breathe. If you're laying down, you have the opportunity to feel the entirety of your body against the floor, and you have that opportunity to just allow it to sink into the floor. Again, just breathe. Try to clear your head. Try to focus. And we will move into our session. Thanks for taking some time with me just to breathe, just to get ourselves ready.
Thank you so much for that very peaceful introduction. Okay, I'll be bringing the rest of your group in.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Gavan, and my pronouns are he, him. I'd like to start today with the land acknowledgement and start by articulating that though we're and acknowledge that we are in an online environment and that we're joining from various parts of the country and the location. I'm joining you today from St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. You are perhaps joining me from other parts of the province, other provinces in Canada, and perhaps even other countries around the world. I'm located on the island of Newfoundland, and so I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that this particular area is the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, whose culture has been lost and can never be recovered. I also want to acknowledge that the island of Umda Umguk, which is the Mi'kmaq name for Newfoundland, as the unceded traditional territory of the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq. I also want to recognize the Inuit of Nunatsiavut, Nunatukavut, and the Innu of Nitassinan, and their ancestors as the original peoples of Labrador. Land is sacred to Indigenous people, and ways of being and knowing, so in other words, learning, come from relationships to the land. Given our focus today on teaching and learning, it's only appropriate then that we stop, name, and reflect on those connections. As a settler myself in Newfoundland and Labrador, I commit to working in the spirit of truth and reconciliation to make a better future for all. And so I'd invite you to take a moment to think about where you're joining from today, the relationship of the Indigenous peoples to the land, and finally, your own relationship to the land where you join from today. If you'd like to open the chat window and recognize or reflect on where you're from, you'd be more than welcome to do so at this time.
Thanks so much, Gavan and Angie, for the opening as well. I'm just going to give a quick overview of how we're going to run this session, because we're going to be running it a little bit differently than the other sessions the last couple of days. So actually, in the spirit of meditative inquiry, our session is going to be run as a conversation based around 4 questions. For each question, one of us will lead off with our thoughts in response to that question, and the rest of us will share our thoughts in conversation as we go. While the questions are planned, the conversation itself is not. So we're going to kind of see where that takes us. We'll spend approximately 10-12 minutes or so with each question, leaving time at the end of the session overall for questions and discussion. But in addition, we'd like you to feel free to post comments or questions in the chat as we go, as you think of them. We may refer to some and not others, and may come to some more at the end. Gavan is going to keep us on track with time. Aswani notes that dialogue or conversation, as we're conceptualizing it, is key to meditative inquiry. So we're using this format as we explore these ideas. We thank you in advance for joining us on this exploration of meditative inquiry in higher education, and bear with us as we kind of experiment with this format. Leigh-Ann is going to start us off with the first question, which she'll share with us and then go forward and make comment upon. Thanks, Leigh-Ann.
Thank you, Suzanne, Gavin, and Angie, um, for the contributions here to start off our session. So the first question that we are going to explore in our conversation this morning is, how does meditative inquiry connect to professional work and personal development in higher education? This question really resonated with me, reflecting a lot on what's happened the last few years within both my professional and personal developments, which has been quite large for myself. And I think in reading Ashwani's book and exploring meditative inquiry over the last few months, it's really, there's been this realization of that I really identify with many of the practices and the elements of meditative inquiry. And it's actually helped me move forward both in my personal development and professional development as a way to, um, I would say, guide what I previously looked at as more of a process of critical analysis, which I was came through my academic training and was very productive and helpful for me in both my personal and professional development. But I had struggled over the years to say that it wasn't. I used to say the phrase, it wasn't grounded. I didn't feel grounded. And so through exploring meditative inquiry, I've really found that it emphasizes the elements that I was missing, while I felt that I identified with a lot of the practice that is described in meditative inquiry, such as reflection, awareness, connection, and collaboration, exploring different perspectives and mindsets. That holistic element and that personal element, particularly empathy, was missing in my own personal practice. Well, I do feel like I had it more in my professional. So I found that really taking the time, having the time and space, as Angie prepared us for this conversation, and just that taking the time and space to connect to where you are as a person within my work, and doing that with faculty members as well. So really focusing on that time and space, and not rushing and not thinking about the outcomes of a practice or a conversation or a meeting. Taking that opportunity to really have a holistic approach, and using meditative inquiry as a means to engage both with myself through reflection and my own development, but with faculty. So in my role, I, as an educational developer, and I work with faculty who are designing courses, who are exploring different elements of their teaching, working on developing teaching dossiers. And I'm finding meditative inquiry as a means to approach this work, to connect with faculty, to really work and have conversations that come first in helping kind of unpack where they are in their teaching, and that is affected by their personal life. While that may not be something that we need to explore in our conversation, is providing that space to realize that where individuals are on an individual personal level kind of affects how they're going to maybe approach their teaching in different situations. So I find that holistic approach, and that kind of the questions, deconstructing the thinking with faculty to understand oneself as a teacher, And really, I personally like exploring with regards to teaching dossiers. Why do we teach a certain way? And then to understand why we teach a certain way and the approaches, those things that we value as an individual, as an educator, and explore how, this might connect with the diverse students in our classroom. So this is kind of what I've been thinking about, and even just this morning, my thinking expanded upon it. That increased awareness of I was struggling a bit with my reflection, and I felt like my mindset and my work and my personal development, I felt like we're in a good place. I'll say productive, and that word productive is really, it's really been what I strived for, and it's kind of irritated me lately, if I'm going to be honest. That was the emphasis, and the emphasis was on the productivity, the outcomes of conversations. And when I had that time and space for myself and faculty members in the discussions we were having, I realized that shouldn't be the driving factor. And yeah, so those personal connections and how they help inform faculty support and decisions, and those connections are really, it's very timely, this conference, I will say personally for me, because it's really helped me, and I'm going to use the word ground some of my existing practices that I think align with meditative inquiry, but they were missing something for me personally.
I really like that idea, Leigh-Ann, of the journey. I think that's kind of what you're saying, is that the journey matters. A colleague of mine and I have been working on the importance of conversation to faculty teaching development. And one of the key factors has been, or ideas we've had, is the importance of meandering conversations without purpose, without direction. And it really aligns well with the meditative inquiry process, where it is the journey that matters as opposed to the product, the outcome. Yeah.
And we said, oh, go ahead, Angie.
I was just going to add in on the conversations, and I'm not sure that this example fits. In the last month, when I was working as the Teaching and Learning Center coordinator, and at St. FX, everybody got their teaching evaluations, I just put out a message and said, happy to have a conversation if you'd like to help interpret your evaluations. And I met one-on-one with 3 colleagues. 2 were pre-tenure, 1 was mid-career. The importance of that one-on-one time versus sometimes, and maybe this connects to your bit on productivity, the productive end would be, let's have a big group meeting and let's say, this is what you do with these evaluations, which I'm not sure works very well, because I think our individuality, who we are, our experiences, the approaches we've taken, that all needs to be considered as we interpret what's been said, or how, in terms of how are we going to use this now in a reflective way to make the course better for the students and for ourselves. So it's just that whole, the one-on-one conversations, it may not be the most productive, but it might be the most effective.
But what interests me with the notion of the meandering conversation, and even within the context of interpreting teaching evaluations, I found that example to be helpful, Angie, is the tension that I think we feel between how we're trained as scholars, how we work to how productivity is measured. And even with those conversations, though they may be meandering, if they're focused around teaching evaluations, for example, I still think there's an end in mind. And that end in mind is often about fixing, and I put that in scare quotes, fixing deficits that may be identified, which within the context of meditative inquiry, is a tension that I face, because though we can have conversations and they can be meandering, I think often, if speaking in my position, where you work and invite conversations with faculty members, often there's an assumption that you're working towards something. And maybe that's an assumption that I'm simply making, but I flag it as a challenge to our work though we can engage in conversation, and though it is to ensure, back to your notion, Suzanne, is around that notion of meandering and purpose. And I'm not sure I've been, speaking frankly, able to allow myself to have those kinds of professional conversations that are where purpose is co-discovered rather than, or co-defined, rather than perhaps coming together with pre-held agenda or pre-held assumptions as to what we need to achieve, even in an informal conversation.
I really think that's an important point, Gavan, about how we're trained as academics and how we function as teachers, as academics. I think there's a real tension there. For myself, one of the things that I loved about teaching, my original discipline was history. What I loved about teaching was forming the opportunity for collaboration and conversation in the classroom. And whereas in my academic discipline with my colleagues, in the discipline of history, there was more of a focus on competition, critical analysis, which is where Leigh-Ann started, being right or having a better idea, or all those sorts of things. And one of the things that I loved about teaching, and then by extension educational development, which is where I've been the last couple of decades, is the sense that we are working together towards a common goal, which is around this question that meditative inquiry asked, which is, what is the purpose of education? And I think that question opens for a lot of people the idea of working together, of common purpose and goal, and a better world, and those sorts of ideas. But I do fear, from an educational development standpoint, that as we professionalize and as we academicize, I don't think that's a word, but as we make more academic educational development, I fear, and I see, because I've been in a long time, an increase of competition, of status, of hierarchy.
If I may, it's an illusion of rigor that channelizes. To go back to your metaphor of a meandering, I see and hear meandering, and see waterways that are traveling on a very flat plane and slowly change over time. Rigor adds channels, which actually and that limits the possibility. So I really appreciate that metaphor. I will note that we should likely not end this conversation. Be aware that we should tie it into our next question.
So I have the next question, and I hope I can tie it in well. I do want to point out, Laura's made some great comments in the chat as well, and tied in with what you've just said, Gavan, in terms of when we, add the rigor, we lose that ability for innovation. So perhaps that word is a good word for me, is innovation. So how does meditative inquiry inform classroom practices in higher education? So when I think of this, and I haven't read everything yet in Ashwani's book and the collection of essays, they are fantastic. What I've read so far, I'm recognizing terminology that I didn't realize was an approach I was following. So let me give you some parameters in my response here. In my classes, I don't teach like most people do. That's not a fair thing to say. I don't really know what a lot of people do, but I'm not just your go in the class, tell the students what I want them to know, give them assignments that they tell me back what I said. I don't do that. I haven't done that for 25 or 30 years because I didn't like it. I didn't like it as a student, and I don't believe regurgitation is actually a form of learning. So my classrooms, even my hard science, which is physical growth and development of children, and children only grow in one way. It doesn't matter how I feel about it. You know, they grow taller, they gain weight. That's what they're supposed to do. In my health classes, which allows a lot more meandering. Meandering is such a good word today. But I want my classes to be interactive. Yeah, I have things I'd like the students to learn, but they don't have to tell me that. They don't have to repeat it back to me. I want them to use what we've talked about in different ways. I want my classrooms to be classrooms in which students are asking questions, questions that maybe I don't have answers to, because sometimes I don't know everything. I definitely don't know everything. I know I don't. My goal is, in other words, my goal is to have my students learn how to think versus what to think. Not interested in exams of regurgitation. I'm interested in self-reflection. I'm interested in students taking what we do and apply it. Now, this is the other parameter that I think is important to understand with my classes. My fourth year classes have service learning tied into it, where we, in one way or another, are promoting physical activity to children in the community. I have programs where kids actually come on campus, and my students spend a couple hours a week, either with toddlers or with children, and I am there all the time. So I am there to help them perhaps form some questions, to help them or point out something that I see that it's like, oh, did you see how that toddler's moving? We assume they're just going to crawl like this, but look at that one. That's a bum scooter. Like, that's a different form of development. Or did you see the older children? Did you see the difference in who's able to kick a ball and who's not? You know, to bring potentially other things in. So I'm there. I could go on about things that I do in a classroom that are different, how I will, I recognize that capacity to just sit and listen is limited. So we stand up, turn around, talk about things, always connected to class. I do 1-minute papers, self-reflections, and then when they want, they can share. The obvious think, pair, shares, those sorts of things. It's not about just listening to me. So I'll just pause for a moment and see what my colleagues want to add here.
Yeah, if I can respond, as I read the literature around meditative inquiry, I see, like you, Angie, another lens through which to see classroom practices, and yet we see themes that emerge from different kinds of discourse related to teaching and learning that I think are really, or practices that occur in the classroom that can be shared. So one thing that I'd even articulate with what you talked about is around the sharing of power within the classroom and being aware of the locus of control. As I read about classroom practices in higher education that are tied to meditative inquiry, it's about acknowledging and decentering power. And quite often the way that classrooms are built in a very Western higher education practice is that the instructor holds implicitly all the power, makes decisions about the course and the curriculum, limits the physicality and the embodiment of students within the classroom. It's bounded in a physical space, seated. And I see meditative inquiry practices interrogating those and pushing back against them, taking people out of a physical or moving people through physical space in a learning experience. Not centering, we have to be aware that with power, we can, as instructors, especially within a institutionalized higher education system, we can never we're never not the most powerful in the room. I think that's an important thing to flag. But being cognizant of the fact that we can share it and share decisions. And so for me and my own teaching practice, it's about being aware of myself as my own embodiment, my own physical presence, and the power that I hold implicitly. And then interrogating that, asking questions, and deconstructing it on an ongoing basis.
Thanks, Gavin. I really resonated with a lot of what you said. And kind of Angie, going back is like to what you said about teaching students how to think. I find that seeing what their responses are and how that they are engaging in conversation to me is so interesting, and going back to that time and space to be able to do that. One of the small things is allowing students that time to think before engaging in a conversation. And when I first started doing that in my own teaching practice, it was really like unsettling, like that quiet, and some faculty members will identify with that. And that's, I think we talked a bit in our conversation, is an opportunity for us to reflect on our teaching and how the conversation's going, so we can do our own thinking about what's going on in the classroom. And I do find meditative inquiry, to go to one practice, as an example, is student and expectation. So kind of expanding on why we're doing particular things and their understanding of it. Is I do find that having the conversations around that really important, and seeing where sometimes assumptions can be made on the expectations of what we're doing in class and why we're approaching different elements. So I do find that aligning, or just the awareness of maybe differences in expectations, having conversations in that area is something that's I find aligned with meditative inquiry in the practice as we're talking about it here today.
Yeah, I think what I want to add to the conversation is a couple of things. One is about the I don't know, psychological, emotional feeling that you create in a classroom as a teacher, which allows you to share power potentially. I think that's really important, because in the courses that I've taught over the last 10 years, where I'm teaching graduate students about teaching and learning in higher education, I think the most important thing, most important opportunity I want to give them in that classroom is to question what they've learned about education as a student. Because a lot of it is that instrumentalist piece that Ashwani talks about, that a lot of which is not productive for that true deep learning, and for true deep questioning about things in the world, and in particular in my context, to question the way that we teach and the way we ask students to learn, that's not always productive. And I think providing space where students feel that they can struggle with themselves and with each other to understand where they've come from, where they want to go, how they might want to shift themselves, and how then that may impact their students, I think is really important. I'll just and one other thing that I've been very fortunate to experience was that in the end, was that particular course was a pass-fail course, because it's a non-credit course that, while is on the books with the Faculty of Graduate Studies, the Faculty of Graduate Studies didn't want us to give a grade, because if a student got a poor grade, that would impact their disciplinary program. So it's a pass-fail course, which originally we were a little annoyed about, to be honest. But interestingly, and as I'm reading a lot more now about ungrading, turns out that when students don't have to work for a grade, they have to figure out something else to work for. And it feeds really nicely, as it turns out too, into meditative inquiry, where it's like, why am I here? What do I really want from this course? And students have said to me, if there's no grade, what am I getting? And that in and of itself is a huge educational question that really helps to shift the framing.
I just want to add, Suzanne, and kind of building on what Gavan said around power, and kind of trying to distribute and give that power back, and your comment about reading kind of the climate of the classroom. I think that if we can work to give power back at particular situations when it's really needed, so like those times when you come in and you sense that your students are struggling, and so we do our quick check-ins on, it could be on a scale of 1 to 10, how's everyone doing? If you get a room of 3s, well, you need to give that power back and say, okay, maybe we need to figure out what we can do together in that particular time. So I think having that awareness and being able to read and provide opportunity for conversations to read the classroom environment, and then give power back in those moments, maybe sometimes, and that support that's needed in those particular times is, I try to think about why and when I make those specific actions and practices to distribute power back to students, and really looking at student engagement and autonomy in their own learning.
Thanks, Leigh-Ann. If I can tie into a question that we've had in the chat, Polly asks, and the quote here is, I'm interested in how this way of being in the classroom is introduced to students. Is it made explicit in the course outline, for example? I think what we've been talking about is making the implicit explicit a little bit here. And I think what's implicit in this question is pushback that we may get from students who are not used, who are used to a more transactional learning experience, one that's more passive and, quite honestly, probably easier to experience because students are often simply not asked to participate in the same way. They're treated more as a brain in a chair than a body in a community. So absolutely, I think you can introduce this in the syllabus, but I think what precedes this is a very clear understanding of your own identity and philosophy as an educator, and being able to articulate that in a concise and clear way to others allows you to then, in turn, communicate through different means, perhaps through a course syllabus, what a learning experience will look like. But I just want to offer one other practice here that I think is really powerful. One of the things that is a thread is this notion of engaging students and sharing power. And quite often we see courses as having starts and stops, 12-week discrete courses. If you're lucky enough to teach a course again and again and again, one of the things that I like to actually think of is that they are a continuum. A course is a continuum. Students may come in every 12 weeks, but there's a continuum. And so I like to include student voice from previous classes in future courses. And I do that in a bunch of different ways. One of the things that I've done is actually ask students to share feedback that I include in the course outline around what their learning experiences were like. That then ties back to my pedagogical practice that's informed by my teaching philosophy. But it's not me saying what they're going to experience, it's other students expressing what the learning was like within their classroom. And the other thing that I've also done is, in fact, sharing the power, invited students, past students, back into the classroom on that first class, leaving the space myself and getting them to tell students what the learning experience was like, or is going to be like, what it was like for them and what it might be like for them over the coming period, to acknowledge that there's a continuum and that students existed before you and will exist after you. I see that as directly it could be a practice that directly supports a more meditative inquiry approach within our teaching and learning practices. All right, I'm the timekeeper, and I've taken this away over time, so I apologize.
Okay, shall I move on to the next question?
I think it could be a good segue, Suzanne. I'll leave it there.
Okay. So the third question that I'm leading off on is, how does meditative inquiry support teaching development? So just have a few thoughts to share on this. I think that over the last 20 years, higher education has begun to take up many of the instrumentalist approaches of the K-12 system that I've been hearing over the last couple of days from a lot of you here, and increasingly focuses less on the learning for learning's sake, more on that end goal of creating productive members of society who can go out and get jobs, which was quite different from my own undergraduate education, where it was kind of just like, here's stuff to experience and there's really no plan for you. And I appreciated that because I had no plan for myself and I wanted to explore things. And so I think as a teacher, I continue to do that. But meditative inquiry, I think, reminds us to focus on nurturing the spirit of the developing teacher. So less about, certainly early in educational development, it was sort of a tips and tricks, like here are some approaches you can use to kind of make your class better, or whatever that meant. But I think educational developers' roles are to help faculty explore who they are as a person, their relationship to the discipline, their particular discipline, and to incorporate those aspects into their teaching. So you have this sort of holistic process. And Jack Miller said the other day, he noted about presence, connection, wisdom, and compassion. And I love those four sort of holistic pieces that would speak to who a person is and therefore what kind of teacher they would be. I think then as an educational developer, there's a lot of focus on relationship building, the one-on-one piece that we've already talked about, the connecting of different people together that you think might be able to support one another as part of that exploration and discovery of spirit. But I don't think it's talking alone. So we talked about conversation a lot, which involves, we think about it as what we're saying, but I think the other piece of educational development is really, really important. I think it's at the heart of educational development, is listening carefully to what that person is saying. Because often they can't hear themselves, is my experience. They'll be talking about something and they need for you to truly hear what they're saying, so that you can speak it back and they can hear it for themselves, because sometimes they miss it. And when you provide that opportunity, that role as listener, and then engage in that conversation that speaks back to them what they're saying to themselves, it helps that meditative inquiry, exploration of one's own consciousness. And in listening to somebody else's, you learn something about yourself. So there is that relational piece. So Michael Corbett said the other day, because I think we want to help faculty get away from fear that they've had through their own education, the expectations of the academy that they think exists, to get past believing that they have to do certain things or they should do certain things or appear as a teacher. This was Michael Corbett said, that they want to appear as a teacher, to get away from that. Because I think at heart, each faculty member actually really knows what's deep down in themselves, knows what's best for themselves as a teacher and thus for their student learning. And when you get there, I think there's a development of a sense of care for the discipline, care for learning, and for the learner. So I think that gets at one of the core tenets of meditative inquiry, truly understanding ourselves, understanding the classroom, supporting students, and this is the key to educational change. to eventually change the world that students will move into, which seems to be a really key underpinning for meditative inquiry.
I'm really seeing what you're saying, that fear has been such a motivating emotion in the classroom, especially over the pandemic. I see so often fear as a motivating factor in the last few years, but even before that, with regards to the expectation of academia, looking at processes of reappointment, promotion, and tenure. And yeah, I'm recognizing it, and I don't know how to respond. Like I'm struggling with that one myself. So of how to, like, the realities of academia and the environments that faculty are teaching and developing in, where there's different expectations and there's different values, and that there is assessment of teaching, and that could be done with different values, with different focuses. And I think I've often wanted the opportunity and haven't engaged, like the opportunity to have conversations like this with administration and with, like, outside of the individual faculty you're working with, so that you can increase the awareness of this fear. And I don't know, yeah, I have a lot of feelings that I don't know how to approach it, but it's something that I see, and I struggle with how to work with.
I think it's challenging to work with others' fear, in part because we're all so unique, and it may be that for us that's not something we're fearful of. So it requires that deep empathy, and Leigh-Ann, you talked about that earlier, that empathy for others, just, and to listen, Suzanne, as you talked about, to listen, just perhaps just being there as a voice. I'm not sure that there is an easy answer, Leigh-Ann, to how do we work with that fear. Go ahead, Gavan.
Yeah, I think recognizing it and having that awareness of it is really important. And I think, I think about my conversations with faculty that I've had, and it's, yeah, it is listening, it's the awareness of it, and then it's trying to find a way for faculty to work through where they feel supported, but it's not for us to find a way forward. It's sometimes it's just that recognition of the fear, and then I think what I'm seeing is that takes quite a bit of time. And then so how decisions are made in response to that, and things might change. Like, to me, that's more of a journey that's happening.
I might use the was something that I was reminded of earlier this week, and is the framework of the difference between identity and subjectivity when it comes to thinking through fear. I'm postulating right now. My sense is that identity and fear are tightly connected, but as we've learned, identity is socially constructed. Subjectivity is fluid and dynamic. And I think if we're working with faculty members, engaging educators and instructors in conversation and considering this difference, perhaps what we need to be considering as staff and colleagues that support others' development is helping them articulate an identity, but also reflect on their own subjectivity. Identity doesn't need to be fixed. It is socially constructed. And talking about the values that you have that bring you to a conclusion. I mean, fear for me in a really sort of like basal in the most sort of like obvious way over the last 24 to 36 months has really played in higher education around assessment and how we assess students and whether we trust students to be doing right things. But for me, I think that that has everything to do, faculty members and instructors' perspective there's a fear there, but that's ultimately built into their identity, which they often see as fixed. And then I think we need to think about subjectivity as a way of having those conversations. I'll just offer that as a perspective based on what we've talked about this morning.
I'm going to sit and think with that, Gavan. That's, yeah, yeah, thank you for that perspective.
I think it is possible. I think it is possible, if you acknowledge the fear, to work through or past it eventually. Other fears may come up, but I think the fear in particular of how we are treated as learners, learners when we're teachers and learners when we're students, in both sort of learning capacities. We fear being judged and we fear being wrong, and they're very fundamental fears that we have in other aspects of our life as well. So if we're open to being wrong some of the time and being okay with that, it lessens the fear. I think fear is like it's one of those primal aspects of human beings that's just there. But how do we not let it cripple us so that we can't do anything, be able to move forward?
And I'm thinking, like, sometimes I'm hearing fear of failure from students and from instructors. And I think going back to kind of the way that we view learning, the way that I view learning is failure is the process of learning. Like, you learn by making mistakes. So emphasizing what learning is and having a conversation about that, I think, you can changing our mindset and our perspective with fear and what that is of, can really help. And that process can be empowering too. And I guess I just want to go to Caroline's question. Curious about others' experience that faculty are using student comments and evaluations. In many situations, I view students' evaluations are used as a weapon to bully and attack versus support growth and instructor strength. And I definitely have seen that just as recently as the last 2 weeks, and it's heartbreaking. Like, it hollows out, and just supporting a faculty member in that situation. And I think, we know that evaluations are problematic for many reasons, but I think, to me, having conversations about the evaluations, being transparent with what they are, how they're used, and hopefully them evolving to have language to reflect actually what they are and how they're being used would be super great.
I really have to add on to that one, Leigh-Ann. I'm glad you addressed that question right now. I think this is another place where we could give students more power and proactively, perhaps, as you've said, explaining the purpose of student evaluations. I don't know if and how we can get rid of the caustic comments that are not, they aren't going to help anyone become a better teacher. So, sometimes I think there's that need for explain what is constructive criticism. I also wonder, and I want to be careful how I say this, I find for me what is most helpful is not the student evaluations at the end of the term, which I don't get to see until after grades are submitted and whatnot, because they don't do anything for that particular class. The evaluations that happen are the anonymous ones that I do with the class, whether I use a Padlet or a Jamboard or something else that allows them to anonymously provide responses to questions. And then I will sometimes do this right in class, so we all see what everyone is writing, and then I'll rearrange comments and we'll talk about it. So, that we can, it's a way to actually improve that class. I wonder, in the journey of learning, if that isn't more helpful in doing more kinds of evaluations like that, so that when we get those end of year evaluations.
And I know we're probably over and, oh, so Gavin, go ahead.
Go ahead, it's fine.
I was just going to acknowledge, Angie, that like that is, and so many challenges come with those comments at the end, is like the midterm feedback evaluations and conversations they're valuable for so many reasons, in creating community, having students be heard, listening to them. That's something that I could talk about further, but I'll hold off.
Angie, the technique that you articulate takes a lot of vulnerability from the educator as well, being open to that. I think we have to consider that's that giving up that power, and the power in the classroom is not something that can necessarily be easily or as equally given up. I think we need to acknowledge that we're a bunch, that's a sophisticated word, a bunch of white settler scholars on this panel, and we have equity deserving colleagues who can't release that kind of power to the same degree and can't be as vulnerable because of the intersectionalities with race, gender, and so that's not to say that practice doesn't work in your particular situation, but as folks that support others within higher education, and especially a more equitable and diverse higher ed world, we have to be aware of the limitations that others have in the classroom that we don't, simply by our own privilege, implicit or explicit.
Good point, Gavin.
Yeah.
I might move us on to the last question. Just a reminder for folks, the last question is, how do we balance the aspirations of meditative inquiry with the reality of Western higher education systems? And boy, isn't this just a simple question to answer? We'll tidy this up and we'll be done with it. I do want to acknowledge that when we're talking about Western higher education, Suzanne alluded to some of the changes that we see. And it's a critique that's throughout the meditative inquiry literature. Increased instrumentalization, references to Freire, and the notion of a banking model where learners are simply seen as vessels within which that information is to be dumped. And if you dump in enough information, you will be successful as an educator. I think these are all probably lines of theory that we're familiar with and speak. I just want to acknowledge some of the contextual changes that have happened within Canadian higher education. Perhaps not capital W Western, though we are a Western country, but that are important for us to consider as we think about what the reality is. One is that there's been an increased massification of higher education, so that we see enrollments increase. And that in and of itself provides possibility. It allows for equity deserving students to access our institutions in a way that they wouldn't have before. But we also see with the massification of higher education, and so I'll just say also perhaps more of a democratization. We don't simply have the elites attending, we have a more heterogeneous student body. But that comes, if that heterogeneity doesn't come with some acknowledgement of the difference that exists within our classrooms, then we are really at danger of simply reproducing what we know and how we operate within the classroom as educators. And the other thing that another challenge that we have with the massification, I knew I wasn't going to do this. I haven't started the clock for my last question here. I'll start the clock now. Is that we see increased class sizes, and many of the practices that get discussed or that are implicit with a more meditative inquiry model, I see as happening at a particular scale. And so one of the larger questions that I have is, what's the tension between or how do we facilitate, or how do we help others see the possibility of incorporating the practices that might fall under a broad rubric of collaboration, inquiry, reflection, holistic learning in a way that also allows people to be in the classes that we see? Is there a tension there that can't be addressed, or do we need to rebuild a higher education system that pushes back against that massification? I want to talk a little bit about the focus on quality enhancement and continuous improvement. We have accredited programs. My perspective is that any of these developments pose opportunities and challenges. I have to say, from my perspective, as being external to an academic unit, support and looking to move ahead and support the quality of teaching and learning on a campus, I see at times that accreditation and quality enhancement can lead to discussion within faculties and educators that has not happened before. Critical reflection and making explicit the assumptions around curriculum design, around who's included, around what curriculum is examined, that I find is aligned with and engaged in the spirit of meditative inquiry. However, it is also incredibly instrumental in that you can ultimately simply get a very stark evaluation of a program. A program can continue or will have to stop. So there are tensions in there. And to me, it goes back to how we facilitate it. So let me just close in my little opening comments here around where I think we ought to be going, and that is to continue to recognize and recenter the transformative potential of the classroom. The classroom wherever it exists. I'm not talking about a physical space. I'm talking about where teaching and learning occurs. That might be the learning management system. That might be outside of a building. But we talk about 3 pillars of higher ed: research, service, teaching. To be frank, my position is that teaching and service always have taken, well, there might be some notable examples, but I get to speak broadly, get to take a backseat to the prioritization of research. And we heard this earlier in the conference, where we talked about Dr. Pinar, for example, talking about the notion of scholarly production versus authentic production and interest. So I think we need to we have the opportunity to engage in conversations that recenter what priorities and values are, and focus on authentic production, not ignore the notion of research and discovery, but reconstitute that in a way that focuses on the classroom as a locus of collaboration, discovery, conversation, and critical reflection. I'd like to ultimately see a approach to teaching and learning that nurtures the whole person, that doesn't simply see students as a mind, that acknowledges the body, and engages in a conversation about how to address both of those pieces. And then the last thing that I'll say is that we need to create spaces where failure is a feature of the system, and we allow students and others to fail, but learn and improve. I think the fear of failure is that we will simply have a poor system because people continue to fail and there's no change. Failure, as we've articulated so well here, is the mechanism through which people do change, but we need the spaces to allow that to happen. I'll hop off my soapbox now.
That was a great soapbox, Gavan. I think I'm not sure of the others, but there's this moment to pause and just think a little on how to respond. And you're right on the money. I think when you talk about how research is given that priority to the detriment of teaching and service, and there's also disequities among service, who's providing service on campus. I don't know about everyone else's campus, but on our campus, men are able to say no, women are not able to say no. And this distribution of work that's expected to be done affects the ability to do research, and it affects our ability to reflect on our teaching, to be thoughtful about our teaching. And I think our rank and tenure boards, our forms of evaluation, need to address this. I also, and I might open up a can of worms here. I'm in a system where we are not evaluated once you're full professor. I think there's something wrong with that. I do. I don't think we should be just, faculty should still have a real evaluation. And that's not to say student evaluations aren't real. That's just one aspect. I think overall we need to be a little more thoughtful, and that's a little different can of worms.
Oh,
No, go ahead, Suzanne.
I just want to pick up on Gavin's sort of like, what do we value from a scholarly perspective or from a scholarship perspective? And I think even within education, even in higher education, there is a move towards the scholarship of teaching and learning. And interestingly, I've noticed, and perhaps I noticed it particularly because of my academic and disciplinary background, is that there's a big focus on methodologies that are quantitative, focused on methodologies that are social science methodology focused. And there is beginning to be, although I think there's a tension here, because I think there are some people in educational development who are saying that there are worthy paths of research that are creative, that are personal, that feed really well into our learning and understanding about education as discipline. And I think that is another tension that I would suggest add to Gavin's list, that education is about people, and as a result is extremely complicated. And I think some of the examples that have been given in this conference about how people have explored their own experiences, their own lived experiences, and then shared those with others as a piece of learning, can be as valuable as numeric data or social science methodologies that are more quote unquote rigorous, but also constraining. So I think that would be another thing that I think we have to continue to balance, not only in education, but I see that in tenure and promotion too, about what counts as scholarship, and what counts therefore also in what's the scholarship we do around our teaching.
This reminds me of the conversation that we had earlier. I think it was you, Gavin, who said that there was the view that SOTL was a signature pedagogy of education. And, through our conversation, I think it was you, Gavin, who said that it was, the art of conversation and dialogue, really looking at, the foundational pedagogy of educational development. And that really resonated with me. And it's, this is definitely kind of going back and forth. I think my thoughts are jumping all around and kind of connecting what, we've said through this conversation. And I think, going back to what you said around the fear of failure and how we create space for that. That's, there's a lot of topics here that have really provoked my thinking, and I will continue to explore. But I think, needing that time and space to kind of unpack some of it. It's definitely, they're not easy questions.
The other thing I would add, I think, in terms of this question about the reality of Western higher education systems, is also what comes out of meditative inquiry. And it's interesting, Ashwani's book has this tension between Eastern philosophies, perhaps for want of a better word, versus also saying that Eastern philosophies and Eastern countries have been co-opted by Western approaches. So kind of where do we go from there? And the other thing I've been thinking a lot about is how much Indigenous ideologies about community, connection with the natural world appeal to me personally. And how do I feed both personally and professionally into those ideas without feeling like I'm co-opting them? I've been thinking about that a lot. And one of the thoughts I have had about that is that, in fact, in my own heritage, sort of Celtic heritage, there are similar thoughts and ideas there that I can draw upon rather than drawing on somebody else's ideas or feeling like I'm taking them. But if I can relate to those within my own heritage, can I use that as a bridge to some of the indigenous Afrocentric ideas that really, really resonate with me? But I feel like if I step into them, that I'm a white settler who's co-opting them. Where can I find those things within my own self and culture? And I think they exist. They are not primary within Western culture over the last few hundred years. They're not, but they've always been there. And I like the thought of being able to reach to that heritage within myself as a way to then bridge to some of these other, like what I think are very important ideas for learning, education, and for the world.
As I noted in the chat, we are about at time for this question, and I think, according to my clock, we have about 9 minutes left in the overall panel. Do we want to pause and open the floor to more questions? I know there's lots of questions that are being asked in the chat. Susan Brigham asks, as Gavin pointed out, all four of us identify as white. I can't speak for my other panelists, but I certainly do. I'm wondering if you have many other colleagues who do this type of work who could have been invited to join you on the panel. Just curious. It's always a moment of reflection when asked these kinds of questions. And the answer to that, Susan, is yes. I can think of a number of colleagues. They would be across the country. That's the scale that I need to go to be able to think of folks who would be able to speak to this as well. But I do appreciate the moments to pause and reflect on representation on the panel, and appreciate the point that you raise here. It's a tension, yeah, it's a tension for my work, certainly. Having so much unintentional power in my role.
I would say too that there may be invisible identities. I would say, yeah, I am white, but I also represent being a woman in the academy, which has not always been an easy road. That is for sure, both in education and in history. So I think we may carry also, I mean, that's obviously for me a visible identity, but we may also carry invisible identities beyond race. And
we've had a conversation about the notion of service within higher education, and how women and women identifying folk are overrepresented in that kind of work. I think what's also really interesting as a male identifying individual within the field of educational development, it's very much overrepresented by women and women identifying folk. I'm very much in the minority with this work, maybe not in leadership positions, because there's lots of conversations that we could have about who ends up as an academic administrator, but it's just simply not to I'm not dismissing the critique, but I'm also acknowledging that context and positionality matters, and it's further learning, I think, for me specifically. I guess, are there any other questions about what we've said, thinking about meditative inquiry, teaching and learning? Here's a question. Are we optimistic that universities will ever affect a paradigmatic shift away from seeing teaching as less important than publication productivity? I honestly, if you did not hear the introduction, part of my role here at Memorial University is the Associate Vice President Teaching and Learning. This is the hope I live with on a daily basis in order to believe that I can affect change and effect change in my role. So yeah, absolutely. I think that this is possible.
And I think I've seen over 30 years in the university definitely more attention paid to teaching in general, to the emphasis on improving, enhancing teaching in a whole variety of ways that didn't exist, say, 30, 40 years ago. So we definitely have seen that shift. But like we discussed, what kind of teaching are we shifting to, though, is the question that might still be open for discussion.
A really important point, Suzanne, right? Yeah.
So I have hope. I definitely have hope. I'm at a position also where I have decided, sabbatical or not, to volunteer to be on our rank and tenure committee this year, and with the implicit, explicit purpose of paying much more attention to the teaching part of the dossiers. I want to be highlighting that part around the table. I'm not sure what it's going to be like. I've not been on this committee before, but I feel like I have the background that I can have that kind of voice. So doing what I can. I think that was a great question too.
I think there's a tension. I'll speak for Dalhousie, is that we've seen an increasing number of instructor roles which have a lot more time given to teaching, which on the surface seems like really positive, but it does seem to mean sometimes that there is then less emphasis or less concern for tenure track folks to be involved in their own teaching development. I'd like to see that shift. I think if that was one goal that I had, that would be one, to make sure that tenure track folks still, care about, and because if they're doing amazing research, that is a great connection for students. But enabling a route for them to understand how to do that well, to make those connections well, I think is really important, something that maybe kind of lacking at the moment.
I too am optimistic, but I speak from a different position, one within educational development. So not on committees or, higher up on the ladder within administration. And I know that the conversations that we're having, they are rich. I'm seeing a shift in the type of conversations, and through faculty members, they're feeling supported. So I think that ability to lean into that teaching and the conversations around fear while we're having them, and they're fearful of certain aspects, whether that be their evaluations or being innovative and taking a risk in the classroom. I'm hearing that they feel very supported, and with that support, then that we can see some change in teaching practice, and that as the conversations too, we look at having more conversations and facilitating conversations among different groups of faculties and across discipline. I see that kind of that opening to the teaching dialogue and conversation across the community more in the last few years at the Mount.
Leigh-Ann, I think you bring up something in terms of the focus on teaching. There are silver linings perhaps to this pandemic, and I think one of it has been the focus on teaching and learning. I
Yes.
cannot recall at my institution, in the AAU, in the Maple League, so many people having conversations about teaching and learning. I think many of us were forced to rethink about what are the objectives of our course. When was the last time that we really asked ourselves about that? Those of us that teach the same course again and again, why are we doing that assignment? Is that really the best assignment? I think we've had some really good conversations. I hope, because we are talking about hope, that we are also going to take forward things we've learned in the pandemic that work well, that have been better than what we've done, that we will continue with those sorts of things and not, I think it would be going back in time if we simply did what we did before the pandemic, when the pandemic is over.
Yeah, the comment of back to normal, there's no a new normal. And yeah, I don't want to go back. There's some elements that I miss, but I think, it's moving forward. There's lots, and that's a conversation we're having now at the start of term. When we hear the back to normal, I had conversation with other academic support units who are supporting faculty and students. And the conversation is, well, what are we doing different? And what are the expectations between us, our students and faculty? How have they changed? How are we going to move forward? And yeah, the back to normal is problematic to me.
I think Suzanne, you're muted, but I think we're at time. So perhaps we'll cede the floor back to our convener.
Can we just say thank you to all the people who participated in the chat, because it was awesome to
Thank you.
hear from my fellow panelists and to hear from everybody in the chat as we talked. It was really appreciated. Thank you for participating.
Thank you, group. This
Yes,
was awesome.
thank you.
Thank you, everybody who's been listening and sharing.
Bonnie, I will just take a quick moment to thank them, if you don't mind. So
Okay.
really, it was such a fascinating panel. I really enjoyed the way conversation happened, and there was so much authenticity and collegiality in it. I really enjoyed. To me, it was a form of meditative inquiry, a dialogical inquiry. So thank you so much, Leigh-Ann, for helping me put this panel together, and thank you, Suzanne and Angie and Gavan, to be on this panel. I really enjoyed listening to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. It was a pleasure to be invited and participate.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. It was honestly very inspiring to hear you spark off ideas off each other and then involve everyone as a participant in your conversation. And for those of you that aren't aware, there were links shared, very interesting comments that perhaps you didn't get an opportunity to read yet. And if you want to do so, just above the space, if your chat is open, you will see 3 dots to the right. And if you click those dots, the very top option, you should see Save Chat there. And if you click that, the whole chat will download, so you can actually read it in your own time if you don't want to do it now by scrolling through, because it's very narrow. But yes, we will take a break now. It's 10:22. We'll be reconvening at 10:30.